what your political opponents are going to say is they're going to say, well, okay, yeah, enough. Well, do something about it. And I guess now there is this national debate going on. And so it's been a couple days after this shooting, and people are just going to be debating all of these policies. But it seems almost tired at this point to recite the same old litany because it's the same old debate every time. But the do something is not enough. And the proposals that have been made by the Democrats almost exclusively to regulate guns, none of them would have prevented any of these mass shootings. Even the Washington Post admitted that when Marco Rubio said it in 2015. Even the Post fact checker had to admit that that point was right. Then you get on to other proposals that could possibly even be made here. What would that be? To ban guns entirely? Well, you're going to run up against a constitutional problem, a practical problem. There are more guns than people in this country. There's no political will whatsoever to ban guns. And there's not a lot of evidence that banning guns would reduce the murder rate. When they banned handguns in the UK, the murder rate increased significantly. It almost doubled in about 6 years. So it's the same old litany of issues. And I think this is why the people who criticize thoughts and prayers and the people who say, well, do something, it's why they don't tend to get very specific, because they don't have any more of an answer on what to do than anybody else does. They're just demagoguing the issue and pretending that their sympathetic outrage is somehow productive.
So let's assess, how do we stop these? Inevitably, when there's a mass murder, within seconds, Democrats and the media begin calling for the exact same policies they were calling for the day before, which their objective, and more the left is quite candid about it, is to disarm law-abiding citizens throughout this country, to take away your firearms, my firearms, and those of law-abiding citizens. There are many problems with that, but let's just start with a basic one. It doesn't work. Taking away every firearm that Michael Knowles owns would not have stopped this psychopath from murdering children in Uvalde. And by the way, we see that in Chicago and New York and D.C. and California, where they have very strict gun control.
Yeah.
And the criminals still have guns and still carry out murders. If you could wave a magic wand and eliminate all firearms in America, there would be substantially more murders than there are today. I'll give you a statistic from the Obama White House. Now, the Obama White House is hardly a right-wing source. Here's what the Obama White House concluded, is that firearms are used in the United States defensively between 500,000 and 1 million times per year.
Yep.
Used to stop the commission of a crime. So if the left succeeds in taking away everyone's firearms, all of the instances, now that doesn't mean that there are between 500,000 and 1 million gunfights. Many times firearms are used to stop a robbery, to stop an attempted murder, to stop a kidnapping, where the gun isn't fired, but simply brandishing the gun causes the criminal to abandon the criminal effort. And that happens, according to the Obama White House, between 500,000 and 1 million times a year. So eliminating all firearms, I believe, would cause far more loss of life, because it would mean that criminals would be able to maraud, would be able to commit assaults and not be worried about people defending themselves. And by the way, the data, if you look at the jurisdictions with the strictest gun controls, almost without exception, they have among the highest crime rates and the highest murder rates. And places with lower rates of gun control, in other words, with more widespread firearms among the citizenry, you have typically much lower crime rates, much lower murder rates. But let's not skip this question. Is there something we can do to stop these? And I believe the answer is yes. When I first arrived in the Senate, I got elected in 2012. Just after I arrived, Sandy Hook, the horrific school shooting in Connecticut, occurred. And so we had this debate 10 years ago. And when I looked at it, I said then, we need to do something. What do we need to do? Let's get the guns out of the hands of the violent criminals, the felons and fugitives, and those with serious mental illness. And so I authored legislation. It was called Grassley-Cruz. Grassley-Cruz was legislation targeting the bad guys. And so one of the things it did is it improved the background check system. If you look at, we have a background check. So if you or I go buy a gun, you got to run a background check. It runs the check to see if you have a felony conviction. that database is only as good as the information in it. And a lot of the federal government has been lousy at reporting felony convictions to the database. And a lot of states, interestingly enough, many of them blue states, have terrible records reporting the felonies to the background check database. If you look at Sutherland Springs, which was the church shooting in Texas, in that instance, that crime should have been prevented. Why? Because the shooter there, it was already illegal for him to buy a firearm. He was a felon, and he had a domestic violence conviction, so it was doubly illegal. So why was he able to buy his firearm? Well, the reason is that the Obama Air Force never reported the conviction to the background check database. So he went into a gun store to buy his gun. He filled out the background check form, and he lied. He was asked, do you have a felony conviction? He checked the box and said no. He was asked, do you have a domestic violence conviction? He checked the box and said no. They ran the background check, and because the federal government, the Obama administration, never reported his felony conviction to the database, the background check came up clean, and they sold him the firearm. So one of the things Grassley Cruz did is mandated the federal government, the Department of Justice, to do an audit of every federal agency to ensure that all felony convictions were in the database. It also provided funds for states to do the same thing for state convictions. But beyond that, every year there's a vast number of felons and fugitives who try to illegally buy firearms. The Department of Justice prosecutes almost none of them. In fact, I'll give you the stats from 2010, which was the last year there were stats from before when I drafted Grassley Cruz. In that year, there were 48,000 felons and fugitives who tried to illegally buy firearms. 48,000. Of those, do you know how many the Department of Justice prosecuted? 44. And by the way, that continues to this day. The Biden Justice Department still is not prosecuting felons and fugitives who try to illegally buy firearms. Grassley Cruz mandated the creation of a gun crime task force at the Department of Justice to go and prosecute and put in jail felons and fugitives who illegally buy firearms. Now, what happened to Grassley Cruz? We voted on the Senate floor on that bill. It got a majority. It got 52 votes in favor of it. 9 Democrats voted in favor of Grassley Cruz. Got the most bipartisan support of any of the comprehensive legislation that was voted on. So why didn't it pass? Well, it was the Harry Reid Democrat Senate, and the Democrats filibustered it. They demanded 60 votes. So even though I had 52 votes, we didn't have 60. And so it failed because Harry Reid and Chuck Schumer and the Democrats filibustered it.
They're not really focused on this issue, right? They're focused on pushing the same legislation that they've wanted to push for decades now, and they'll use any circumstance to try to push that. But what we're seeing here in the specifics of this actual shooting is in some ways, it seems like it's a repeat of the Parkland shooting. You've got a kid who was showing serious signs of trouble. He should have been identified much sooner. There should have been safeguards placed around this kid much, much sooner. There are now questions about when law enforcement got there, if law enforcement did enough in the moment. You're seeing, I'm not saying it's a repeat of history, but you're seeing lots and lots of similarities, none of which are addressed by the legislation that the Democrats are proposing.